The rain had stopped some time before dawn, though she had not slept enough to know exactly when. She had lain on her narrow rope bed, listening to the drumming ease from a roar to a drip, to a silence so heavy it pressed against the cabin walls like a held breath. When the gray light finally came through the oilcloth window, she rose without lighting the lamp and went outside. The air smelled of raw earth and broken things. She climbed the hillside in the half-dark, her boots sinking into the soft ground between the walls, her skirt dragging at the wet grass. She did not need much light. She had walked this slope so many times that her feet knew where each wall began, where the flat planting strips widened, where the pale limestone had been set most carefully. She climbed past the first wall, the second, the third, running her hand along the top stones, the way a woman runs her hand along the shoulder of something she loves. At the crest she stopped and turned to face the valley. Hatcher's Hollow lay below her in the thin morning light, and what she saw took the breath cleanly from her chest. Where her neighbors' fields had been, the long flat strips of dark Nebraska grass sod that had been turned into wheat ground and kitchen plots and corn rows, there were now raw, pale channels cut into the earth, as though something enormous had dragged its fingers down through the soil and kept going. The creek at the bottom of the hollow was the color of old coffee, still running fast and thick, carrying what had once been topsoil, what had once been the patient accumulation of years, out toward the plains and away forever. 6 farms. Every one of them stripped and scored and grieving in the gray dawn light. She stood there a long time. Then she turned and looked back at her own slope. It was green. The kitchen garden behind the second wall stood undamaged, the bean rows still upright, the late summer squash leaves broad and dark. The grain strip along the fourth wall had been battered flat in places by the sheer weight of the rain, but the soil beneath it was there, still there, held in place by the stones and by the slow, patient logic of the walls themselves. Between each terrace, the water had come down the hill and paused, spread out, soaked in, been passed along gently to the next wall and the next, until what reached the base was a slow seep rather than a flood. Her father had known. He had always known. Something rose in her chest that she had no clean name for. Not triumph, because there was too much grief in it, and not grief alone, because there was something fiercer running underneath. It was older than either feeling. It was the particular ache of watching a dead man proved right by the very disaster he had spent his last good years trying to prevent. She pressed one hand flat against the cool top stone of the highest wall and looked out at the ruined hollow below. She did not speak. There was nothing yet to say. The hollow below had not always looked the way it did now, stripped and gray and mourning. There had been a time when the whole valley seemed like promise itself, when the grass ran thick along the creek and the black soil turned up sweet and clean under a plow blade, and every settler who passed through Hatcher's Hollow said the same thing: take the flat land, take it quick before someone else does. She had been 19 that spring of 1878, still new enough to the territory that the wind surprised her, still learning the difference between a sky that meant weather and a sky that only threatened it. She had stood beside her father at the land office in Creston Flats and watched him pass over the claim forms the agent kept sliding toward him, the low parcel along the creek, the south-facing bench with its deep alluvial soil, the flat quarter section that would have drawn any other man's eye like water to a low place. He had chosen the hillside, the rocky, steep, pale gray hillside that nobody else wanted. She remembered the land agent's face, the careful blankness of a man who has learned not to say what he is thinking. Her father had not noticed or had not cared. He folded the claim form once and tucked it inside his coat with the steadiness of a man who has already settled a long argument with himself. On the walk up the slope that first afternoon, she had carried the leather journal he gave her. Small, the cover stiff and dark brown, the pages blank and smelling of the dry goods shelf where he'd bought it. "Write down what you see," he had told her. "Not what you think you see, what you actually see." She had watched him crouch at the first limestone outcropping, run his hand along the pale face of it, tilt his head the way he did when he was listening for something the land was not yet speaking aloud. Then he stood and looked back up the slope, tracing with his eyes the lines the last rainstorm had carved in the thin grass, the small braided channels where the water had gathered speed and taken soil with it down toward the hollow. He said it plainly, the way he said most things worth keeping. "The stones are already here. The water needs to be taught where to go." She had written it down before he finished saying it. The pencil marks were still in the journal, still pressed into that same page. She had read them so many times, they had worn themselves into memory long before she stopped needing the paper to hold them. She had not understood then, not fully. She had understood stones, and she had understood water, but she had not yet understood what he meant by taught. That water is not a force to be stopped, but a habit to be broken, gently, wall by wall, across the whole long length of a hillside that has been running the wrong way for 1,000 years. That understanding would take the better part of 5 years to arrive. The morning after the third day came in gray and still, the way mornings do when the sky has spent everything it had and gone quiet in exhaustion. She pulled on her boots before full light and walked out into air that smelled of wet stone and torn earth, and something else, something she had no word for, the smell of a hillside after it has been tested. She started at the bottom. The first wall was standing. One stone had shifted near the east end, rotated slightly outward by the pressure of the water moving behind it. But the wall had not broken, and the soil it held had not moved. She pressed her palm against the face of the stone and felt only cold limestone, damp and solid. She moved uphill. The second wall was where the kitchen garden lived, tucked in the flat shelf of earth her father had built behind it, over 5 years of patient hauling and tamping. She came around the corner of it, expecting damage the way you expect something you have already half accepted, bracing before you look. But the garden was standing. The bean poles were leaning, 2 of them knocked sideways by the wind, and the tallest corn had lost a few outer leaves. But the soil was there, dark and wet and close, sitting where it had been placed, going nowhere. The late summer squash rested on the ground like something comfortable and unbothered. She stood among the plants for a long moment without moving. She continued upward. The third wall, the fourth. Beneath the fourth wall, dug back into the hillside itself, was the root cellar, its low timber door barely visible in the slope, framed with flat-laid stones on every side. She had not let herself think about it during the storm. She unlatched it now and pulled it open and held up the small lantern she had carried from the barn. Dry. Not damp dry, not the dry of a thing that had been wet and recovered. Dry in the way of a place the water had simply never reached. The bins of dried beans, the wrapped roots, the cured onions braided and hanging, all of it untouched, still smelling of summer's end and earth and the particular quiet of stored things waiting for winter. She let out a breath she had been holding since the first night of the rain. She found the fifth and sixth walls intact, the seventh with a small gap where two capstones had slid, easily repaired. The hillside above the walls had shed its water, yes, but the walls had caught it, slowed it, let it sink rather than run, and the soil between them had stayed. She walked back to the second wall and sat on its top course of stones and looked down at the hollow below, where the valley farms lay. From this height she could see it clearly, the long pale scars where the topsoil had gone, the muddy creeks still running brown, the flattened, ravaged look of fields that had been given no reason to hold on. Her father had known this was coming. She had seen the look on her father's face that night, though she had been only 19 years old and had not known then what she was seeing. She knew it now. The community meeting had been held in the back room of Creston Flats' only dry goods store, in the long light of a July evening, when the air smelled of sawdust and lamp oil and the particular restlessness of men who believed they understood things. Her father had attended because he always attended. He sat near the back, his hands folded on the table in front of him, patient in the way a stone is patient, not because nothing is happening, but because the happening is too slow for most eyes to catch. The prosperous neighbor, a broad man named Aldrich, who held the flattest, richest claim in Hatcher's Hollow, had stood up midway through the meeting and turned to face the room, rather than the man running it. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a fistful of dark loam, cupping it between both palms the way a preacher holds water for baptism, letting its weight speak before he did. "This," he said, "this is what a man earns when he reads his land right." He let it trickle slowly between his fingers. "Now I ask you, what kind of man spends 3 summers hauling stones up a hillside no one would claim on a bet, stacking them crooked across a slope the rain don't even want?" The laughter that followed was not cruel in the loud way. It was worse. It was comfortable. The laughter of men who had already agreed with each other before anyone spoke. Her father did not answer. He did not shift in his chair. He watched Aldrich's loam fall and said nothing at all, and when the meeting ended, he walked home in the dark, without hurrying. That night, she had seen the lamp burning late in the corner of the cabin, where he kept his field journal. She had not asked what he was writing. In the morning, the journal was closed, and he was already on the hillside before sunrise, moving stones. She did not read that entry until after his death. She had opened the journal on a cold morning in January of 1882, after they had buried him in the frozen ground near the upper fence line, and she had turned the pages slowly until she found the date. July the 14th, 1879, and beneath it, in his careful hand, the letters formed with the deliberate pressure of a man who wrote rarely and meant everything he committed to paper. "They are watching the soil. I am watching the rain." 7 words. No anger in them. No bitterness. No score to settle. Only the calm precision of a man who had already been proven right in his own mind and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. She had read those words so many times since that the page had softened at its center from the pressure of her thumb. Now, sitting on the second wall with the ruined valley spread below her, she understood that he had been watching this exact morning. She sat on that second wall until the silence of the valley stopped feeling like an accusation and began to feel like an invitation. Then she set down the journal, smoothed her apron, and walked down the hill. The path into Hatcher's Hollow was familiar under her boots, but strange in every other way. The creek that bordered the lower fields had run brown for 2 days after the storm, and even now the shallows were silted and slow, the banks carved out in raw notches where the current had eaten them. She could smell it before she saw it, the turned mineral smell of earth that had been moved against its will. She stopped at the edge of the first field. The Brant family's oat strip, which had stood chest-high and green a week ago, was gone. Not flattened. Gone. The topsoil had lifted clean and carried itself to lower ground, and what remained was pale and close-grained, the color of old ash, with none of the dark richness that meant living dirt. She stood at the edge of it for a moment without speaking, because there was nothing adequate to say to a field that had simply ceased to be a field. She found the Brants near their root cellar. The entrance had caved under the weight of the runoff, the timber lintel sunken into the ground at an angle, the earth above it settled and sealed. 3 seasons of stored provisions. A year of labor in glass jars and salted crocks, packed careful as prayers into the dark. The woman of the family was sitting on an overturned bucket near the entrance, not crying, not speaking. The particular stillness of someone who had passed through the worst of it and arrived at the place that comes after. She approached quietly and set down the basket she had carried from her own root cellar. Dried beans, a twist of salt pork, 4 jars of last summer's preserved plums. Small things, but real ones. The woman looked at the basket and then up at her, and something moved across her face that was difficult to name. It was not gratitude exactly, or not only that. It was something older and more uncomfortable. The expression of a person recalibrating something they had been certain of for years. She did not press it. She said only that she had more than she would need through to spring, and that her root cellar had held, and that the offer was open and would stay open. She said it plainly, without ceremony, the way her father had always delivered the truest things, as a statement of fact rather than a performance of generosity. She spent the rest of the morning walking the hollow, 2 more gardens buried under river silt, a family's entire kitchen plot, which had been tucked between a low bank and a fence row, filled in to the fence rails. Everywhere that same pale scoured earth where dark soil had been, and everywhere she stopped, she saw it, that same look in their eyes. The shame first, and beneath it, quieter, newer, still learning its own shape, the first uncertain thread of wanting to understand. She had seen that look before. Not on the faces in the hollow, theirs was new, still raw at the edges, but on a different face, in a different season, 3 years, gone now. Autumn of 1880. The sky had turned the color of pewter and stayed that way for 2 days running. A hard, insistent rain that came not in sheets, but in a kind of relentless pressing weight, as though the clouds had decided simply to lean on the earth until it yielded. She had been 18 then, not yet carrying the full weight of the claim, still learning the hill the way a person learns a difficult language, by making mistakes and listening for the correction. They stood together in the barn doorway, she and her father, watching the water move. He did not say anything at first. He only watched. She watched beside him, and for a long while the only sound was the rain on the roof and the creek beginning to find its voice somewhere below in the hollow. Then she saw it, what he had already seen. The first terrace wall was doing exactly what he had said it would do. The water reached it, slowed, spread sideways along the face of the stone, and then, not all at once, but gradually, the way a held breath releases, it sank. It pressed down into the soil behind the wall and disappeared. What trickled over the top arrived at the second wall quieter, slower, already half spent. By the time it reached the third wall, it was barely moving at all. She turned to look at him. He was not watching the terraces anymore. He had already moved, not physically, but in the way his mind moved, always ahead of whatever had just been proven. He had the journal open against his forearm, the stub of pencil working in short, deliberate marks. And he was sketching the placement of the fourth wall, not celebrating, not turning to her with any version of, "I told them so," just planning the next thing, because the next thing was where his attention had always lived. She asked him once, later that evening, why he did not feel the satisfaction she expected him to feel. He looked up from the journal with a mildly puzzled expression, as though the question had arrived in a language he recognized but did not often speak. "The walls worked," he said. "That is a fact now. Facts do not need my feelings." It was the kind of thing the neighbors would have found cold had they heard it. She did not find it cold. She had come to understand that this was simply the way he held certainty, not as a prize to be displayed, but as a tool to be used. The rain had confirmed the design. The design demanded the next wall. That was all. She had stood in that barn doorway and memorized him without knowing she was doing it. The way his pencil moved, the angle of his attention, the absolute absence of gloat. She was carrying all of it now, down here in the hollow, in her two hands. She was still standing at the base of the hill, near the gray barn, when she saw the figure coming across the hollow floor. Not a man's stride, a woman's, deliberate, a little careful, the kind of walking that meant a person had decided to do a hard thing and was not going to stop until it was done. She recognized her before she was close enough to call to. The wife of the family whose low field ran directly to the creek bend, the same creek that had carried their topsoil in long amber ribbons 3 days past. She had watched it from the hill, helpless at the watching. That field had been the richest in the hollow, black and deep and flat as a table. The kind of land her father had never been offered, and that would have meant nothing if he had. The woman stopped a few feet off and did not offer a greeting, the way a social call would have begun. She was somewhere past 40, weathered in the way the country weathered everyone, and her hands were still dirty from the field work she must have come from. She looked at Maren the way a person looks at someone they owe an explanation to, even when the debt runs the other direction. "I want to know how he did it," she said. "The walls, whether it can be learned by someone who does not already know." There was no ornament in the question, no apology tucked inside it, but no hostility either, just the plain shape of need, offered without wrapping. Maren did not answer immediately. She turned toward the barn and gestured, and the woman followed. She had kept the journal in the same place since the winter, inside the dry goods box, on the shelf above the workbench, wrapped in a square of oilcloth, because the oilcloth had been his habit. She unwrapped it the way she always did, with both hands, as though the care were something owed. The leather cover was worn pale at the corners. The pages had softened with years of handling. She had not shown it to another living person. She opened it to the middle section, where his writing changed, tighter, more certain, the handwriting of a man who had started to understand what he was actually doing. She found the passage she had read so many times she could have spoken it from memory. But she wanted the woman to hear it the way it was written, in his own choosing of words. "Water does not destroy where it is given room to slow," she read aloud. "The stone does not stop the rain. It only asks the rain to pause. In the pausing, the soil catches its breath. A wall is not a dam. It is a persuasion." She heard the woman beside her go quiet in a particular way. The the silence of someone receiving something they had not expected to be given so directly. She turned the page and kept reading, her father's voice moving through her own, patient as limestone, steady as the hillside that had not moved. She paused in her reading. The woman beside her had not moved, but Marin felt the shift in the air, the way you feel a cloud pass over the sun without looking up. She lowered the journal to her lap and let the silence do what silence sometimes must. And in that quiet, the past came forward. It had been the winter of 1881 going into 1882, and the cold had arrived early and stayed mean. The hillside had gone iron hard by the first week of November. The seventh wall was not yet finished, only waist-high in places, missing its capstones along the upper third of the run, the pale limestone sitting in loose piles where he had dropped it before the first freeze took the ground. Most men would have waited for spring. He was not most men, and he knew, though he did not say it plainly, that he might not have another spring to give it. The illness had come on slowly, the way some things do, so gradually that she had argued with herself about what she was seeing. A cough that deepened through October, a shortness of breath that made him set down the stone hammer more often than he used to. The way he stood some mornings with his hand pressed flat against his chest, looking out at the terraces below him, not working, just looking, as though checking on something. She had worked beside him every day through those cold weeks. The ground would not break, so they could not dig. What they could do was lift and set and fit. She learned to read a stone's face the way he had taught her, to find the flat plane hiding inside the rough edge, to let the weight of one stone close down over the gap left by the one below it. He spoke less as the weeks wore on. He showed more. A hand placed on her wrist to slow her, a slight tilt of his chin toward the place the stone needed to shift before she had seen it herself. She learned in the cold, with numb fingers and fogged breath, beside a man who was teaching her everything he had left to teach. The morning he set the last capstone, she remembered it had been clear and brittle cold, the sky the color of pale ash. He placed the stone with both hands, pressed it down until it seated firm, and then he rested his palm on top of it and stood very still. He did not speak. She had waited, thinking he would say something about the wall, or the winter, or the spring to come. He said nothing at all. His hand lay flat on the capstone, the way a person rests their hand on a sleeping child. Not pressing, not claiming, only present, only there. She had not understood it then. She was beginning to understand it now, sitting with a woman who had read his words aloud and gone quiet in receiving them, her own hand resting open in her lap as though she too had just set down something heavy and was waiting to feel what remained. 3 families said yes before the week was out, not with ceremony, not with speeches. The Halverson woman sent her eldest son up the hill with a folded note that said only, "When do we start?" The Priu brothers came themselves the following morning, hats in hand, standing at the base of the slope and squinting upward at the 7 walls as though seeing them for the first time, which, in the way that mattered, they were. A widow named Aldrich from the far end of Hatcher's Hollow came last, arriving with a wheelbarrow of her own and a look on her face that asked nothing and offered everything. She set a date, 4 days hence, first light. The night before, she opened the field journal and read through his notes on stone selection until the candle burned low. A wall built from chosen stone will outlast a wall built from convenient stone by a generation. She had read that line a dozen times across the years. She read it once more and closed the book. Morning came cold for September. the sky pale and flat. She was already on the slope when the others arrived, the iron-headed hammer hanging from her right hand, the two-wheeled barrow loaded with the small, pale limestone pieces she had sorted the evening before. She did not give a speech. She picked up the first stone, turned it in both hands until the flat face showed, and placed it. Then she looked up and waited for them to watch. That was how her father had taught her, not with words first, with hands first, and words only when the hands had already shown what language would have taken twice as long to say. The work was slow. It was meant to be. She corrected without embarrassment, lifting a stone someone had placed, and showing, through the angle of her wrist, how it needed to seat lower on the slope side. She showed them how to pack the dry fill behind the face stones, how a wall breathes water through its gaps rather than holding it until the pressure wins. She showed them how to read the hillsides lean, the way her father had shown her, in the cold, with numb fingers. No one laughed, no one talked much at all. The sound on the hillside was the sound of stone against stone, the hollow knock of limestone being tested, the scrape of boots finding purchase on loose ground. The Priu brothers worked with a grim steadiness that looked almost like penance, though she did not think of it that way. She thought of it as work. Work was its own kind of language, and she had learned to speak it fluently. By midday, 12 feet of new wall ran across the Halverson slope, low and rough and crooked, in the way that meant it had been laid to follow the land. She set her hammer down and looked at it a long moment. It was a beginning. The wall was a beginning, and beginnings, she had learned, always carried their own grief inside them. She had known it was coming. Through the autumn of 1882, she had watched him slow the way a creek slows in late summer. Not suddenly, not all at once, but measurably, day by day, the current losing something it could not recover. He coughed through October. He coughed through November. By December, he was sleeping more than he was waking, and she was carrying his share of the work, and her own, splitting wood in the gray mornings before he stirred, checking the livestock herself, bringing soup to the low bed near the stove where he had moved when the cold made the loft impossible. He did not complain. That was the thing about him. He had never complained, not even when they laughed at him at Creston Flats, not even when the Prevey brothers stood at the trading post and called his walls a fool's monument loud enough for the whole room to hear. He had only looked at them with that steady, patient look she had spent her whole life trying to learn, and then he had gone home and set another course of stone. He died on a Tuesday in February, quietly before dawn, while the hillside was buried under 2 feet of snow. She was 23 years old. She wrapped him in the good wool blanket, the dark one with the red stripe along its border that had come with them from the east, and she sat with him until the light changed. Then she went outside. The ground was frozen hard. She worked for most of 2 days with the iron bar and a spade, breaking through the frost in the narrow terrace shelf between the 5th and 6th walls, in the soil he himself had held in place. It was slow, brutal work, and her hands bled at the knuckles from the cold and the iron. She did not stop. She buried him there, in the soil that had not moved since he first stacked stone against the hill. She did not mark the grave with a cross at first. She marked it with a flat piece of pale gray limestone, the same stone as the walls, pressed flush with the ground so that it would not heave in the spring thaw. She did not send word to anyone. She did not leave the claim. There was no one to send word to, not really, and the claim was what remained. The claim, the walls, the journal with his careful handwriting, recording what he had learned about water and soil and the stubborn patience of stone. She brought the journal inside that night, set it on the table beside the lamp, and opened it to the first page. She read until the lamp ran dry. The last of the 4 neighboring hillside plots received its final stone before the end of September. Maren had not counted the days exactly. They had blurred together into a single long effort of sore shoulders and chalky hands, and the satisfying scrape of limestone settling into limestone. But when she climbed to the top of her own 7th wall at dusk on a Tuesday evening and looked down across the slope, and then out across Hatcher's Hollow, she could see what had been done. 4 hillside claims, once written off as too rocky and steep for serious farming, now wore their new walls the way old hills wear their own outcroppings, as though the stones had always meant to be there. The lines were not perfectly straight. Some of the new builders had struggled with the angles, had stacked a little loosely here, or let a corner drift there. She had not corrected them too sharply. Her father had told her once that a wall built by a man's own hands will hold better than a wall built to someone else's perfection, because the builder knows every stone in it personally. She believed that now. The hollow below was quieter than it had been in August. The stripped fields had been turned and planted with what late cover crops the neighbors could manage. Winter rye mostly, scattered thin over ground that had lost its richest inch. It would come back slowly. The creek still ran a little muddy at the edges, where the banks had not recovered. These things would take years, not weeks. She heard him before she saw him, the soft crunch of boots on loose gravel coming up the slope from the east. She knew who it was before he spoke. He had been the loudest voice at the Creston Flats Trading Post in 1879, the one who had coined the phrase everyone repeated for years after. A fool's monument to wasted labor. He stopped a few feet below the wall so that he had to look up at her slightly. He took off his hat. "I have been trying to find the right word for several days," he said. He was not a young man. The storm had taken a full season's harvest from his flat field, and it showed in his face. "I don't know that I've found it yet, but I came to ask you something, if you'll allow it." She waited. "I never knew his name," the man said. "Your father, I knew his walls. I knew what people said about them." He stopped. "I'd like to know his name, so it can be said properly, so that when I tell people, and I mean to tell people, I can say it right." The dusk had gone a deep amber behind the ridge. A nighthawk cut low across the hillside and vanished into the blue. She looked at him for a long moment before she answered. She told him. She said it clearly. The way you say a word you have been holding in your mouth for a long time and are finally ready to release. He repeated it back to her once, quietly, getting the sound of it right. Then he put his hat back on, nodded once, and walked down the hill, toward the hollow, without another word. She watched him go until the dusk folded him into shadow. She did not sleep much that night. In the morning, she rose before the light had fully settled on the ridge. The air was cool and smelled of wet stone and late summer grass. She went to the small lean-to beside the barn, where her father had kept flat stones quarried from the upper slope. A reserve, he always said, was for repairs, for the walls outlasting both of them. She chose one piece herself, pale gray limestone, wide as her 2 hands spread open, thick enough to hold a line cut into it without crumbling. She carried it up the hill in both arms, past the first wall, past the second, up through the terraced steps where the kitchen garden still stood green and unhurried, past the root cellar, past the 4th wall and the 5th, climbing until she reached the seventh, the highest, the one he had finished last, in the autumn of 1881, a year before the illness took him. She set the stone down on the flat crown of the wall. She took the iron-headed hammer from her apron pocket. His hammer, left to her along with everything else that did not amount to much, but mattered completely. She worked slowly, striking careful shallow lines into the face of the limestone. The sound rang small and clean against the hillside. It took her the better part of an hour. When she finished, she set the capstone at the highest point of the seventh wall, facing east, where the sun would find it first each morning and last each evening. Then she opened the journal. The cover was soft from years of handling. She turned to the page she already knew, the one he had written on an ordinary spring afternoon in 1878, when the first wall was barely knee-height, and the laughter from Creston Flats had already begun to follow him home. They are watching the soil. I am watching the rain. She read it once. She closed the journal. She stood at the top of the seventh wall and looked out over the hillside, the terraces stepping down in their crooked patient lines, the garden green below, the small gray barn at the base, and beyond it, the hollow where, come spring, a dozen new walls would begin to rise. The sun cleared the ridge. The name cut into the pale gray stone, caught the light and held it, as the walls themselves held everything worth keeping.